we host this webinar at a very, very, very trying time, not least because of the genocide in Gaza, the waging conflicts and wars in Sudan, the continuing exploitation of the DRC, the Congo, and the attacks on Haiti, on the Sahel states, and of course on China. For many people, comes at a time of misery and despair. But as anti-imperialists, as people who take inspiration from revolutions of the past, present, and hopefully inspiring us for the future, we find it extremely important to operate on the axis of revolutionary optimism. And we find it's our duty to keep ourselves educated, especially in times like these, when there are tariff wars, when there are hot wars, when there are escalations from the imperialist countries, from the global north. And in this webinar, we will be exploring exactly what it says on the tin, the element of what does Black liberation mean in the context of Trump's tariff wars, continuing tariff wars, I should add, on the global south, and the ongoing Cold War on China. So some of the questions we'll be hopefully answering and discussing by our amazing speakers are, why are the United States doing this? Why is Trump's administration doing this? Is this new? Is this only a Trump only thing? The short answer is, of course, no. It is a continuation of US imperialist policy and hegemony that has spanned decades, if not centuries. But more importantly, we also want to explore the question of what does this mean practically for the global South? What is the impact on the people, but also on the countries as sovereign nations? What has there been response so far? And what do we think is the reaction to come, especially with countries like China putting retaliatory tariffs back on the US? I've been speaking to a lot of people recently who have decided, because they don't know what's going on, they've completely checked out of the news altogether. But that isn't what we want to encourage here. We want to encourage this to be a space for you to ask those questions, to be curious, to be open-minded to learning about everything that's going on in the world, and taking a more anti-imperialist approach to understanding that, the world doesn't have to be as it is. Things can change, we can change it, and we have the power to change it. And we only need to draw inspiration from the peoples, the masses all around the world who are working towards this already. But we also need to be quite material in our analysis. We need to understand the forces at play. And that's why we've invited Margaret, Radhika, Carlos, and Myriam to give you a very, very brief sort of rundown on what's been going on. So the more questions you have, the better. We really want to have an insightful and nuanced discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Margaret Kimberley. Margaret is a New York-based activist for peace and social justice. She is a Black Alliance for Peace Coordinating Committee member, as well as an executive editor and senior exec columnist for the Black Agenda Report. Her recent book, Presidential: Black America and the Presidents, gives an intellectual gem of prophetic fire about all the US presidents in their history and the deep roots in the vicious legacy of white supremacy. So with all that, please take us to school, Margaret.
Thank you. I hope I can live up to that kind introduction. Thank you so much, Fiona. Greetings, everyone. As Fiona said, I'm Margaret Kimberley, and I'm very grateful to the Black Liberation Alliance for this invitation. And I thank you all for being in attendance and joining us today to discuss Trump's tariff wars on the global South and the new Cold War on China. I have to say that I think this was a war. I think of people in this country, in the US, as being constantly immiserated and becoming, in effect, part of the global South. I think that's definitely true for some communities. And this is a war on people, on working people in this country and, of course, around the world. I'd like to start out by, oh, I'm sorry, hold on a moment. I didn't turn this off, sorry. And now I can't turn it off.
May I interrupt? Maybe it might be better if you stop sharing your screen and we could see Margaret more bigger. Fiona.
Oh yes.
Okay,
Your screen
I'm
is
good
being
now.
shared, and so we
Oh
just see
no.
Margaret in a tiny little there. Now we'll
Thank
be
you
able to
so
see
Oh
much.
my
Margaret
goodness.
much better. Yeah.
You're a star, Radhika.
Now I'm self-conscious about my makeup and my hair and everything. Thank you.
You look
Anyways,
perfect, Margaret.
thank you so much. Sorry about that. But I was starting to talk about the United States when this is our second time living with Donald Trump. Talking about Trump in particular can be a challenge. He is unique as the U.S. presidents go. A man who had no experience in public office, who marketed himself as a successful businessman when he is in fact a business failure, having bankrupted himself 5 or 6 times, uh, through social media, through a reality show, which he starred in, and self-promotion. He convinced people that he could be a good president. And as a persona, he's very different. He's very, as you all know, boastful, very happily ignorant, and surrounded by people who are also like-minded, and he's so petty. He actually barred media from the White House who would not agree to refer to the Gulf of America instead of the Gulf of Mexico. I kid you not. The Associated Press were banned from the White House because they said they would still use Gulf of Mexico. Or who just this week greeted the new Prime Minister of Canada and restated his intention to make Canada the 51st US state, which is absurd for so many reasons. This aggressive, the deportation regime, sending people to third countries to be imprisoned, to make examples of them, to exult in cruelty. So he is different in that way. He does things in an upfront manner that others were less transparent about. But the important thing, I think, to remember is policies follow what is established foreign policy by the U.S. I think when these questions come up, it's important to remember that the U.S. wants to have what is often referred to as primacy, hegemony, control over the rest of the world, militarily, politically, economically, and maintaining dollar hegemony is part of that plan. I think it's interesting that we are having this session on May 8th, the day when the U.S. and its allies declared victory in Europe with the war, I'm sorry, 80th anniversary of the end of the war ending in Asia also in a few months later. And at that time, 80 years ago, the U.S. was emerging as the most powerful nation in the world, the newest empire in history, had not been invaded, lost in comparison to the Soviet Union and China and other countries, relatively few people in the war. Its industries were helped by the war. So the U.S. Had the best manufacturing, produced the most food, and the U.S. held sway like that, economically and militarily, with enormous power. But empires will do what they do, and capitalism will do what it does. Um, and the U.S. has used hard power and soft power and the domination of the dollar as the world's reserve currency to keep the world subjugated. George W. Bush famously said, you're either with us or against us in regard to his so-called war on terror. But as empires do, and as countries that thought they were friends are learning, everyone is considered to be against the US. You're either an enemy or a vassal. And the end result is that the decline is accelerating. The crisis of the US empire and capitalism is accelerating by Trump. He's speeding up a process that had been in place. So we see countries with this attack on these tariffs are an attack on the whole world, actually. So we see nations like Japan and the Republic of Korea standing with China, which makes sense. China is their close neighbor, despite particularly troubled history between Japan and China, but they want protection from the US and from this erratic president. And both countries are capitalist. Both countries are under US occupation. I think it's important to say that. I don't know how the US escapes being called this occupier when that is what it is. But they've been treated in the enemy category. Every country has been slapped with tariffs to some degree. And there is some backtracking as conditions change, but this tack that Trump is taking with tariffs, I'd like to remind people it's the kind of thing the U.S. has been doing in other ways. For example, enacting unilateral coercive measures, sanctions as they're commonly known, but unilateral economic coercive measures, sanctions. The U.S. sanctions about a third of the people in the world, so that countries like Iran and Venezuela that produce oil are prevented from selling their oil. And a country like China that says they'll buy their oil, that's another reason to target China. And even Cuba, this small country which has dared to remain socialist, is prevented from earning revenue through tourism. But I also, speaking of Cuba, want to point out there's so much continuity with Trump. When he was president the first time, he placed Cuba on a list of nations that were not just sanctioned, but a state sponsor of terrorism list, which is absurd. It doesn't mean anything. And so the little breathing room that Cuba had was taken away. They even tried to destroy tourism so that Europeans and others, if you travel to Cuba, you can't travel to the US, and to hurt that country as much as possible. And then we have other nations as disparate as Eritrea, Nicaragua, Iran, Libya, Cuba, Zimbabwe, Syria, the DPRK are punished for various infractions, namely being in opposition to US policy to some degree. But sanctions, there are a part of US insistence on simply beating up on the rest of the world. And this new tariff regime, as I'm calling it, we know that China is the main target, but even a little country like Lesotho, a small country that is entirely surrounded by South Africa, Lesotho has a trade imbalance with the U.S., mostly from textiles. They make jeans for Americans consumers. But they were hit with sanctions anyway on April 2nd, what Trump referred to as Liberation Day. So big countries, small countries are all treated alike. Even when Prime Minister Carney of Canada visited Washington a couple of days ago, the Secretary of Commerce said that Canada has been living off of us, which is silly for so many reasons. But these trade surpluses that exist between Lesotho and the US and China and Canada, that's what the US capitalist class wanted. They destroyed manufacturing in the US, part of a conscious decision to immiserate workers and what we call a race to the bottom, to impoverish people. Now that they succeeded in doing that, but as the old saying goes, be careful what you ask for. China, the country targeted most, became an economic powerhouse, in part because of the plan to use it as the US factory. But the thing that interests me now is Trump getting pushed back here from that same capitalist class. So, for example, recently the chief executive officers of retail giants Walmart and Target and Home Depot and others, because they have access to meet with Trump, warned him that the shelves in their stores may soon be empty. already the first container ships that left China after April 2nd arrived in the port of Los Angeles with 30% fewer goods than they ordinarily would have, just as the capitalist leaders wanted. So we see, and we also see the impact on people in the US, farmers, mostly conservative people politically, Trump voters, have been decimated. So China bought soybeans from US farmers, but they aren't anymore. They're buying them from Brazil. Cattle, now China's buying cattle from Australia. So we see an impact on people here. And there is something unique about the US, this fantasy about reindustrializing, which I don't think anybody really wants. It was a way of destroying workers who had better incomes, destroying unions. So they succeeded in doing that, but now the rot is spread throughout the country, accelerating the decline, and countries making trade deals now with one another. We saw on Wall Street, the stock market going down because of Trump. So I don't know what the ruling class are going to do with this man that they said they could live with, but the rest of the world can't live with the US, regardless of who presidents are. For Biden, for example, continued putting Cuba on the state sponsor of terror list. Biden continued the tariffs against Chinese cars, against
One minute
Huawei.
left.
So, thank you. So we see this country that is a problem. So I hope I've made clear Trump and these tariffs are part of the problem, but a country that insists on being on top, insists on dominating, is a huge problem for the whole planet. So that's it for me. I think I ran over a tiny bit. Sorry about that. And I look forward to interacting with folks when there are questions. Thank you so much.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Margaret, for that very sort of like, yeah, play-by-play sort of rundown of exactly what America's been up to in the past few years, decades. I thought it was really interesting that you said of the US's plan to use China as a US factory, because that's exactly what it is. It's throwing a tantrum right now because it can't get its own way. It can't use China the way it wants it to. So it's, again, very interesting to note. And what you mentioned about today being sort of Victory Day on the 8th of May, we're seeing world leaders, the president of China, Xi Jinping, we're seeing the president of Venezuela, Traore of Burkina Faso, everyone sort of like aligned in this sort of like new world that's trying to be built or trying to resist US hegemony. They're all the ones going to Moscow to celebrate Victory Day, whereas the Keir Starmers and Donald Trumps of the world, where are they?
I wanted to say something, if I may. We're always
Yes,
told
please.
Putin is isolated. Putin is isolated. Half the world is in Moscow commemorating Victory Day. But yes, thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Margaret. And now on to our next fabulous speaker. We have Radhika Desai, who is a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg in Canada. And she's also the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group at the university. She has proposed a historical materialist approach to understanding world affairs in publication Geopolitical Economy After US Hegemony, Globalization, and Empire. I'm ashamed to say I haven't read it in full yet, but the bits I have read, absolutely fascinating. And Radhika has published over a dozen books and goodness knows how many dozens and dozens of incredible papers. So I will leave you in the very well and capable hands of Radhika. Please give her a warm welcome in the chat.
Thanks so much, Fiona. And it's really a great honor to be part of this very important initiative of creating this Black Liberation Alliance and all the educational projects that you are undertaking. So you've asked me to focus on, well, we are all focusing on Trumps and tariffs and so on. So I guess in the time that I have, I want to make about 7 different points, and hopefully I won't go over time, but just let me know as usual when I'm near to the end of my time. So I want to start by making a very simple ground clearing point. Tariffs are not necessarily bad. Tariffs have a very important role to play in development. In fact, no country that has developed successfully, and that includes China, has developed without tariffs. Indeed, as I say, it's possible to adopt tariffs and go wrong, but it is not possible to develop without tariffs, especially in the early part of your development phase. Indeed, the United States itself was among the countries that imposed the steepest tariffs in its own process of development going back to the 19th century. And of course, as people know, after 1929, and in the context of the Great Depression, the U.S. imposed some pretty draconian tariffs, which then, of course, it was itself forced to undo. And desperately try to find new markets under Roosevelt and so on. But nevertheless, historically, what the United States has always been prone to imposing tariffs. This is not something peculiar to Trump. Biden also imposed tariffs. Before that, George Bush Jr. And basically Ronald Reagan was among the most protectionist presidents, post-war presidents up to his time. So, this has a long history. The difficulty is, and the United States, as I also say, has a longer history of weaponizing all sorts of economic relations, whether they are trade relations, financial relations, you name it. It has weaponized them against those it considers its enemies. The difficulty is that tariffs on their own don't do anything. And the kind of blanket tariffs that Trump is imposing are actually totally ruinous. Tariffs work best when they are part of a broader industrial strategy in which a responsible government, with the interests of the national economy at heart, has identified sectors which it's going to promote, which it considers to be most likely to succeed, and then it would have sectorally specific tariffs. So imagine that you are trying to develop the steel industry, then you would have steel industry related tariffs and so on, but you wouldn't have the kind of blanket tariffs that Trump is imposing. So I just wanted to say that, and a final point on this, every developing country, like in fact today, one of the big problems for most developing countries is that they are too exposed to the vagaries of the international market. Now, I'm not saying that Trump's tariffs are a good thing. On the contrary, they are very bad. They're going to cost the third world countries a great deal. But in the long run, they actually do need to have coherent development strategies in which they will probably employ tariffs themselves. They should, if they're not. So that's one set of points. Now, let's come to Trump. Trump has been elected in the context of a deep crisis, a pervasive crisis that goes across, it's an economic crisis of deindustrialization, financialization, inequality, bad quality jobs, etc., etc. And Trump has been elected by claiming that he's going to resolve the crisis for ordinary people. But unfortunately, he has no strategy for resolving the crisis for ordinary people. In fact, I doubt he owes ordinary people, or he feels that he's, he's in any way personally, in any way holds himself responsible for the fate of ordinary people. So he's not really an agent that is going to resolve the crisis. He's really another symptom of the crisis, and that he is being buffeted about by its main elements, and he will continue to be. So that's something that I also want to state at the outset. Thirdly, Trump was able to get elected because he understood one very important thing. He understood that you can no longer win elections by telling Americans that their economy is doing very well. No matter how many statistics you can manufacture to create the impression that the US economy is doing well, ordinary working people know that it's not doing well. And so you could not win elections. So Trump cottoned on to this. And twice he was elected by basically saying, the economy is suffering. We need to do something about it. So he told this one truth. But of course, having told this truth, and being who he is, which is the representative of the corporate capitalist class of the United States, he had to combine that with perhaps an even bigger lie. So having admitted that the US economy is not doing well and therefore told this truth, he had to combine it by telling a big lie, which is what is the source of the US's economic difficulties. He could not say that the source of the economic difficulties is the application, despite repeated failures, despite the continuing decline of the United States over 4.5 decades, the same neoliberal policies of privatization, deregulation, lower taxation for rich people, higher taxation for poor people, giving more and more freedoms to corporate capital, etc. These had, this is the real reason of encouraging financialization. These are the real reasons why the US economy is ailing. But of course, he couldn't tell people that, because if he told people that, then he would be going against the interests of the very people he represents, namely America's corporate capitalist class. So he said, the reason for your difficulties is China. It's immigrants, it's trade, etc. And of course, these tariffs come out of that. So I think that this is another very important thing you have to remember, is that Trump has been elected on the basis of this big lie, perhaps let's say an even bigger lie. But now he must engage in a great show of fulfilling his promise. So all this tariff drama is all about that. What matters is making a big show. I mean, as Margaret pointed out, today the tariffs are on, tomorrow they are off. Today there's tariffs on everything, tomorrow there's no tariffs on, electronic goods, etc. The reason for all this is, of course, that these absurd tariffs cannot win. They are going to create big problems, which I'll come to in a second. So he is going to go back and forth. He is going to, not appear very coherent with his tariffs. But the point is, it doesn't matter so long as he can, at the end of, well, at various points, because there is no end, he keeps turning around and contradicting himself. But so long as somehow he can make it look as though he is winning, that he is, successful in doing what he set out to do, no matter how false it is. So, right now, Trump keeps saying the economy is doing better than ever before, etc., when in fact you've had the worst numbers for a long time. So, and not that I put a great deal of store by these numbers. If we had a Democratic president, I would be, questioning the numbers themselves. But whatever, for what they're worth, the numbers are really bad. And Trump keeps saying that, everything is going fine, because that's what he wants. He wants to appear as a success. He wants everything to appear to be fine. And that's all he cares about. Now, so that's my third point. My fourth point is that a lot of people say that with Trump, we are looking at the end of neoliberalism, the end of free markets, free trade, etc., etc. But it's not the end of neoliberalism, because neoliberalism was never about free markets and free trade. Neoliberalism was fundamentally about reinforcing the power of the big monopoly corporations that destroyed the American economy. And so it was really about giving them more freedoms, taxing them less, etc., etc. So in that sense, we are simply looking at a new phase of neoliberalism in which Trump, Biden himself represented a new phase of neoliberalism, in the sense that it was what I call pseudo-civic neoliberalism, in which the state claims to spend a lot of money, but most of that money simply goes into the pockets of the big corporations, which you saw with his Inflation Reduction Act, with his Green Economy Act, and all these sorts of things. In Trump's case, it's a new phase of neoliberalism in the simple sense that he simply has given so much power personally to big CEOs, whether it is Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whatever. They have his personal ear, and essentially what Trump is going to do what they want him to do. And he also is not beyond providing a lot of subsidies. And of course, he's going to cut taxes further, we are told, for them. So in that sense, Trump does not represent the end of neoliberalism, simply a new phase of it. Indeed, I think as long as capitalism exists, we will simply get one or the other, a phase of neoliberalism. Now, when Trump was elected, during the campaign, it looked as though Trump represented a particular fraction of the American ruling class. So not the established ruling class, what some writers call the house-trained or domesticated ruling class, who were kind of more sedate, who supported the Bidenites, but a more cowboy or maverick version of the American corporate capitalist class, like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and so on and so forth. But what you began to see very soon after his election is that they were all there, whether it was Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos or whatever, people who had kept away were all there for the inauguration. They were essentially the American ruling classes uniting behind Trump because they recognize that the Democrats are in no position at the moment anyway to win elections. So Trump is all they've got, and they've all united behind him. So essentially, Trump represents the same political classes as Biden represented. So now, my sixth point, which is Trump must make a great show of fulfilling the promises, as I've said, but quite frankly, there is absolutely no coherence to this, given how Trump has sent so many sensible people into a paroxysm of, looking for some kind of logic in Trump's policies, so that people have even invented a new word. They say you can't logic wash Trump's policies. You can't find a logic that isn't there. Or to put it in more mundane terms, people have been trying to find a method in his madness. But I think that there is no method. It is pure madness. And the madness is not Trump's personal psychological derangement. It emerges from the profound crisis in which the United States finds itself. But, he has trotted out a number of justifications for his policies. Margaret already referred to one, which is reindustrializing the United States. Yeah, sure. You can impose tariffs and reindustrialize the United States, but not the way Trump is doing it. You can only do it if you have a proper industrial policy, which Trump has not got. And he will not have, for the simple reason that in order to have an industrial policy, a state needs to be capable of telling capitalists what they can do and what they can't do. In the United States, it's the capitalists who tell the government what it can do and what it cannot do. So in these circumstances, it is not possible to have a reindustrialization strategy, an industrial strategy. And what's more, an industrial strategy in the present context in the United States would require a rolling back of the massive financialization of the US economy, in which all the huge profits that are made by big American corporations are essentially channeled into financial investment rather than productive investment, and without massively re-regulating the US financial sector in ways that would set back the clock going back, I don't know, 4.5 decades, you are not going to get any kind of reindustrialization. Trump says that his tariffs are going to strengthen the dollar. No, the dollar has gone careening down. And, many, at least some anyway, economists even agreed with Trump and said that we can expect the tariffs to strengthen the dollar. But no, it's not happening, for the simple reason that, the tariffs are going to affect the US economy itself very badly. Trump imagines that the rest of the world is going to be badly affected by his tariffs. No, and that's why, the rest of the world will become abjectly, subservient and come to negotiate new deals in which the Trump administration will get what it wants. This is not going to happen because Trump massively overstates the US's importance in the world economy. Today, the US is responsible, depending on how you count it, for between about 10 to 15% of total world imports. Yes, that may not be a small number, but nor is it a very big number. And important countries like China have already been warned before. China has been suffering from all sorts of problems, all sorts of tariffs and other trade measures that Margaret was mentioning for a long time, like going back to George W. Bush's aluminum and steel tariffs, Obama's pivot to Asia, Biden's, small yard.
About a minute left.
Defense tariffs, yeah. So he, so while Canada and Mexico may be particularly vulnerable, I think the rest of the world can do without the US. Trump talks about reshoring prosperity. No, he's simply going to create more inflation. He's already creating more inflation in the US economy. And there is one thing two more things. So Trump says that there's going to be all this tariff revenue. God knows whether there's going to be tariff revenues, because if America, at the kind of tariffs he's imposing, Americans may not buy foreign goods to the same extent. And if they don't, there will not be any tariff revenues. But whether tariff revenue materializes or not, he's going to use the anticipation of tariff revenues to give big corporate tax cuts. So ordinary American consumers will end up paying a tax, which is the tariffs, in the form of high prices for commodities. Meanwhile, rich people in the United States will enjoy huge tax cuts. So in none of these justifications actually work. So my final point is this. Overall, Trump imagines that he's going to hold court and everybody is going to come and plead for better terms with him. I think that the way in which he has proceeded with the imposition of tariffs, the uncertainty he has created by imposing them one day, withdrawing them the next, etc., is actually going to have a very interesting effect, which is that the rest of the world on the whole is going to essentially start planning for moving away from economic engagement, or whether trade, investment, or any form of economic engagement with the United States, which is going to leave the US isolated. It's going to leave the US high and dry. And this is going to create bigger problems than Trump imagines, because over the last several decades, the US economy has been the economy that has been globalizing to the greatest extent. That is, it has become an externalized economy to an extent that was not that was not the case a few decades ago. So the US economy has become reliant on the rest of the world economy to an unprecedented extent, while and this is going to make it particularly vulnerable. So this is what I wanted to say. Sorry if I went a little bit over time. Thank you.
Not a problem. No, thank you so much for that incredibly astute analysis of the tariffs and what's going on. I think you have just a way of like phrasing things extremely concisely. The one thing I just picked up from the beginning is when you said Trump is another symptom of the crisis. And I think that's something we really need to get ingrained into sort of like our politics, especially on the left. I know here in Britain, even every time people speak of America, they speak about Trump as if he's some sort of aberration. He's completely the exception to the rule. But actually, as you say, Biden was one phase of neoliberalism, and now so is Trump. And we have to be able to analyze it in that way to be able to prepare for what comes after him, because he's not going to be the first or the last president to make maneuvers like this. So thank you so much. That was incredibly insightful, especially I had not heard of the term logic wash before. Now I feel like I need to look it up and figure out what that's all about. America produces the most amazing things. But that drives us actually quite nicely to our next speaker, because we were speaking about, what Trump is actually doing is he's moving people away, or moving countries away from economic engagement. One of the countries, of course, that Trump has been battling over the past few months is China, and China's refusal to just give in to the ridiculous tariffs that have been imposed upon them. And yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to hear a bit now from Carlos Martinez, who's going to be talking to us about the China perspective. So Carlos is the co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Please check them out if you haven't already. And they seek to support, defend, and build a deeper understanding of Chinese socialism. Carlos has recently published a book, The East is Still Red, Socialist China in the 21st Century. And he also co-edited People's China at 75, The Flag Stays Red. So someone who's quite apt at telling us, spilling the beans about what's going on in China. Tell us, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for that very kind introduction. And thank you so much to the Black Liberation Alliance for inviting me. I apologize, I haven't actually had a great deal of time to prepare. And furthermore, I've been placed on a panel with people that are far smarter than I am. So, apologies for any lack of coherence. And if you've got any complaints, please address them to the Black Liberation Alliance. Other people have mentioned that it's Victory in Europe Day. I'd like to kind of add my voice to that. And in particular, I'd like us to remember the approximately 20 million Soviet people that made the ultimate sacrifice in order to liberate Europe from fascism. Our education system and our media in the West tells us that it was Churchill and Roosevelt. It wasn't. So I'm going to break the habit of a lifetime and talk about China. The first thing to say, about this Trump administration's tariff war is that it is primarily designed to weaken, undermine, and isolate the People's Republic of China. It's part of a broader program of so-called decoupling from China and a broader new Cold War on China, a system of hybrid warfare that incorporates economic measures, diplomatic measures, and propaganda measures, along with a significant military component in terms of, the deployment of hundreds of thousands of troops to the Pacific region, the US military bases in the Philippines, in Guam, in Okinawa, in Japan, in South Korea, in Australia, the deployment of sophisticated weapons systems to the region, and the various attempts to create some sort of Asian NATO. And as such, the way I see it, Trump's tariffs are really just a continuation and a deepening of Obama's so-called pivot to Asia that was designed by Hillary Clinton, first announced in 2011. And this pivot has been pursued and deepened by every administration since then. Trump in his first term launched a trade war against China and revived the quadrilateral security dialogue. Biden launched a semiconductor war against China and created the AUKUS grouping. And now Trump's returning to economic coercion, like the art of the deal on a global stage. All of these US administrations, Republican and Democrat, have pursued freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. All of them have ramped up the supply of weapons to Taiwan province. All of them have encouraged Taiwanese separatism. All of them have undermined the One China principle with a view to creating a potential trigger point for a hot war on China. So this is like the geopolitical context for Trump's tariff madness. And as such, it doesn't really constitute a fundamental break with existing US foreign policy. Are the tariffs really about China? Well, sorry, but they can hardly be about anything else. Like, it's perfectly clear that the US government's stated objectives for their tariff war are patent nonsense, right? Nobody in their right mind believes that global tariffs are going to succeed in reviving US manufacturing, as Radhika has very eloquently pointed out. To do that, the government would need to embark upon a systematic, long-term program of state-backed investment and cultivation of human capital via education, via training. And the Trump administration is even less likely than previous administrations to do those things. Meanwhile, global production chains are incredibly complex. Relocating manufacturing isn't just a matter of knocking up a few factories and hiring a few workers. The US is to a significant extent a post-industrial economy, the result of neoliberal policies that have been pursued for the last almost 50 years. So Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick's notion that the US working class is going to turn into what he calls an army of millions and millions of human beings screwing in little screws to make iPhones is beyond absurd. This, it's a bizarre fantasy that's being sold to the working class in the US in order to win its support for a trade war that's very much not in its interests. Nor can we expect tariffs to increase US income. Quite the opposite. As Radhika has said, tariffs are paid by the importer, and that cost is typically passed on to the consumer. So there's no new income. At best, there's a transfer of wealth from consumers, the majority of whom are working class, to the Treasury, which, having demonstrated its remarkable generosity with wide-ranging tax cuts to the ultra-rich, is in need of a boost. But of course, higher prices are going to mean fewer sales, and so the overall national income will decrease rather than increase. So it's abundantly clear that the tariffs are a geopolitical weapon, not an economic weapon. And the focus on China can be seen in the fact that it's been subjected to the highest level of tariffs, 145%, compared to the mere 10% being imposed on countries like Britain that do whatever Trump tells them to do, and in the fact that all countries other than China are enjoying a 90-day pause on their tariffs. In fact, US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated openly last month that the objective for the tariffs is to persuade Japan, South Korea, and India to participate in what he called a grand encirclement strategy to isolate and weaken China. Why would anyone want to isolate China? Why would anyone want to weaken China? Essentially, the US is seeking to punish China for its success in building a modern economy and for its refusal to bow down to US hegemony. It's punishing China for protecting and developing its sovereignty. China's rise has come as a bit of a shock to the US ruling class. China's reform and opening up process from the late 1970s involved gradually integrating into global value chains at the very bottom rung of the ladder. China had a huge, well-educated, capable, and very cheap labor force that was perfect for labor-intensive manufacturing in fields like textiles, toys, very simple electronics. Obviously, it was never the Chinese leadership's plan for China to remain at the bottom of that ladder, but that was what US strategists were banking on. And in the course of the next 4 decades, a lot of Americans got extremely rich investing in China and outsourcing their production to China. But China continued to climb up the value chain and to grow its economic strength to the point where now it's a science and technology powerhouse. It's a global leader in telecommunications, in advanced manufacturing, in infrastructure construction, in space exploration, in supercomputing, in quantum computing, in renewable energy, in electric vehicles, and several other fields. Like, of the world's leading research institutions, several of them are in China now. China produces more academic research papers than any other country. Furthermore, it's caught up to the US in overall economic size. Measured by nominal GDP, China's set to overtake the US in a few years' time. Measured by purchasing power parity, PPP, China overtook the US a few years ago. Either way, China as a serious economic competitor is the last thing the US expected to see. And China's rise disrupts the whole imperialist system, the whole system of unequal exchange. It gets in the way of the relationship that the US wants to have with the rest of the world, whereby it can design the global financial system in its own interests. It gets in the way of loan conditionality. It gets in the way of unilateral sanctions. It gets in the way of multiple forms of economic coercion. Why would an African country go to the IMF for a loan on condition of privatizing its water system when it can get a loan from China at a much lower interest rate and with no punitive neoliberal conditions? How can the West use sanctions to force Russia, Cuba, and Venezuela into submission when those countries can trade at high volumes with China, etc.? And China's rise is also a pretty significant ideological problem. China's caught up with the US in terms of economic size, and China's economy is still growing much faster than the US or the other major capitalist countries. So socialism with Chinese characteristics is actually proving itself in reality to be better, to be more effective than US-led neoliberal capitalism. It's 4 decades ago that Deng Xiaoping said that the superiority of the socialist system is demonstrated in the final analysis by faster and greater development of the productive forces than under the capitalist system. Fast forward to 2025, and that superiority really is being demonstrated. As Xi Jinping often says, China's socialist system allows it to mobilize these vast resources for major undertakings that meet the people's needs and priorities. Why has China made this incredible progress in renewable energy and electric vehicles? Because the government coordinated a national campaign involving the education sector, the public sector, and the private sector to make it happen. It's very difficult to do that sort of thing under capitalism, particularly its neoliberal variant. In the US, the fossil fuel lobby gets in the way of meaningful progress on renewables. In China, there is no fossil fuel lobby. So, China's rise is undermining the whole Washington consensus. So we've got this, number of reasons that the US is desperate to undermine China's economic growth. They want to force China to accept the US's terms of trade, and they want to bully other countries into siding with the US against China. What do they want from China in this trade war? Essentially, they want China to buy hundreds of billions of dollars worth of US products that the Chinese people don't need in order to prop up the US economy. It's good old-fashioned ransom. And it's the same basic substance as the first iteration of Trump's trade war on China back in 2018. What does the US want from other countries? The US wants other countries to lean away from China and towards the US, to participate in decoupling from China. Remember, it was under Trump that the US led this global campaign to persuade countries around the world to remove Huawei from their network infrastructure. That, of course, was rather unsuccessful. It was only hopeless lackeys like Britain that went along with it. This tariff war operates on the same principle, but at a much larger scale. The US is telling countries around the world, divest from China, trade less with China, accept less investment from China, work with us to impede China's development. And because the US doesn't have a positive alternative to offer, it has to resort to threats. In the absence of carrots, they've got to use a stick, and the stick is do what we say, or we'll effectively cut your access to the US market. None of this is working. None of this is going to work. China's been abundantly clear that it doesn't want a trade war. It doesn't benefit from a trade war. It seeks peaceful and mutually beneficial relations with the United States and indeed all countries. But China's not going to back down in the face of US bullying. Foreign Minister Wang Yi put it very bluntly, the US has long reaped enormous benefits from free trade, yet it now wields tariffs as a bargaining chip to make exorbitant demands on other countries. If we choose to remain silent or to compromise and back down, it will only embolden the bully. China is saying it's not 1839 anymore. The century of humiliation is over. No more opium wars, no more unequal treaties. Every tariff increase the US has announced, China has announced a reciprocal tariff increase. Meanwhile, as a Bloomberg article noted recently, China has trade war-proofed its economy by diversifying its trading partners and supply chains, by building up its domestic consumption, by developing its own technological and scientific self-reliance. Its reliance on imports from the US and exports to the US has decreased significantly in the last few years. China is the largest trading partner of 2/3 of the world's countries, and increasingly the global economy needs China more than it needs the US. The US ruling class wants to isolate China, but actually it's going to end up isolating itself. Meanwhile, the US is digging its own grave in terms of its role in the world. All countries can see that the US is this gangster regime. It's not a reliable partner, and it doesn't consider itself
1 minute
bound
left.
by international law or by norms of behavior in foreign relations. So the tariff war is going to fail in both its stated objectives and its real objectives. The obvious concern following on from that is that US imperialism's next weapon against China may not be a metaphorical weapon, right? That the new Cold War will turn hot, and anti-war movements and progressive movements in the West need to be highly vigilant on that score and prepared to do everything we can to prevent that from happening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for that crash course in the Chinese economic strategy and their political strategies too, because I think that's often very much missed whenever there's talk about China. It's always framed from what the US is doing, rather than actually, no, what is China doing there? They're not making this up as they go along. They do have a method to the madness in complete comparison to Trump, as Radhika was saying. And I think it's also very important to note that, back in the 1980s, China's GDP was in the bottom sort of like 10 of the bottom 10 countries in the world. I think its GDP was like 10% of the US's. So for it to come from that to what it is now, no wonder the US is terrified. No wonder the US is acting out in the way it is. So thank you so much for your really sort of like thorough roundup of what's going on in China. I can see some excellent questions coming up in the chat for everybody. But before we go into those, I will introduce you to our final speaker. Last but not least, we have Myriam Kane. Myriam is another one of the co-founders of the Black Liberation Alliance and an anti-war, anti-racist campaigner. She is currently on the executive committee of Britain's Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and she's also involved in the Senegalese Workers' Party, PASTEF, where she's been organizing for the past few years, including the sort of uprising that led to the election, leading to the rise of power of President Diomaye Faye and the Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko. So please take it away, Myriam. I'm sure you'll have lots to feed us still.
Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I hope I will be sounding as coherent possible. I've just come down with something, as in today. So yeah, it's called Tariff, about power, exploitation, and unfinished project of Black liberation. Tariff, ooh, what was that? Should I keep going? Okay. So yeah, Trump's tariff on countries in the global south, those often impoverish a formerly colonized nation in Africa, Latin America, and part of Asia. These tariff weren't just economic tools, they were instruments of the broader nationalist agenda shaped by vision of American hegemony. Central to challenging America is the rise of China, which is why they are a primary target to this tariff war. Trump's trade war will hit Black people, including the US. It was marketed as a way to bring job backs, as we heard from our speakers, to the United States. But in practice, his tariffs disproportionately targeted countries already on the margin of the global economy. Countries that are home to billions of Black people. Tariffs on goods from this nation made it harder for them to sell products in American market, stifling industry, increasing poverty, and enforcing economic dependency. Let me be clear, economic oppression is a form of racial injustice. When African textile workers or Asian factories workers lose jobs because their exports are priced out of the global market. When Caribbean farmers can't compete because of the US tariff. This isn't just unfortunate, it's systematic. It's the global dimension of anti-Blackness. We are the collateral damage in the US trade war. We have already had amazing analysis from Margaret, Radhika, and Carlos on the impact of tariff and sanction in recent history. But I will say Trump weaponized tariff must be seen in the context of the longer history, from the transatlantic slave trade to colonialism to structural adjustment policies forced by the IMF. Every era has had its tools to keep Black nation under the thumbs of Western imperialism control. Tariffs are just at the latest version and one that almost all US administration have had in common, as we have heard today. Let us not forget about the ways the US threatened those who oppose it. Military attacks against Yemen, who are defending their sea in solidarity with Palestine. Let us not forget about the ongoing brutal blockade on Cuba for daring to have revolutions in America's neighborhood, and the disproportionate tariff on South Africa, especially because land is being expropriated, freed from white settlers. Let us not ignore either the crushing sanction on Venezuela and the trafficking of migrant Venezuelans from the US to El Salvador. So what does this mean for Black liberation? It means we must expand our vision. Black liberation is not just about justice for the Black communities in London or New York. It's also about sovereignty in Caracas, economic dignity in Cape Town, and environmental justice in Port-au-Prince. We must build global solidarity, resisting policies that deepen inequality and divide us by borders while uniting the elite by profit. The global south is rising. We have seen the pressure and threats being imposed on the revolt state in the Sahel, including the multiple assassination attempt against Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. We have seen how AFRICOM is a tool of the United States, where African command leaders of AFRICOM have stated that they need to liberate the people of Burkina Faso. But this shows that those leaders are doing something right. From kicking out the US and French military bases to nationalizing the mining companies or changing their national curriculum to include local languages, these leaders have been working towards sovereignty and independence. With the backing of the people and the diaspora, last week's international solidarity protest with Captain Traoré showed just that. Even now, the IOS continue to show us that solidarity look like in economic terms. They have created a joint passport, a joint bank. We move ever closer to Pan-Africanism, and in doing so, to liberation. Why is China role important? Trump bullying behavior is a reaction to the respectful cooperation working relation China has with other countries in the global south. In Burkina Faso, after lengthy discussion about contract and term of services, China is supporting the development of medical infrastructures and building hospital in Burkina Faso. One of its latest projects is set to be West Africa's biggest teaching hospital, opening later this year. Let's also talk about China's zero tariff offer to 33 African countries. Compare that to the US bullying tactics on the continent. 29 African countries have been slapped with a baseline 10% tariff, and another 22 countries will face up to 50%. The US imposed 50% tariff on Lesotho, the single highest tariff next to China. These are eye-watering figures that cannot be justified by any of the existing trade relations. They seek to punish countries that are already struggling to find room in the US-dominated market. But this is what means by win-win. This is what China means by win-win. Cooperation, it means treating its trade partner as equals while offering solution for the most critical needs of a country, is infrastructure. No country can grow and develop without infrastructure that serves the people. China knows this all too well. So when China says win-win cooperation, China means mutual partnership and stakeholding. Not charity, ravaging debt mechanism, or aid with strings attached. In the words of Thomas Sankara, imperialism is a system of exploitation that occurs not only in the brutal form of those who come with guns to conquer territory. Imperialism often occurs in more subtle forms: loan, food aid, blackmail. Liberation means more than political right. It means economic justice. It means refusing to upset trade policies that extract value from the global south while offering nothing in return but debt and dependence. It means forming partnership with countries like China who are open to and expectant of rigorous negotiation to ensure the best deals between two countries. And that is why we must be vigilant and do all we can to oppose economic warfare through tariff and the military warfare that US is directing against Gaza, and constantly challenge the increased Cold War with China. With these economic, military, and ideological offensives, it is necessary to dehumanize us all. It's necessary to dehumanize us all with racism. And as this increases, so too will the far right that we must also stand up to. In the face of rising fascism and economic imperialism, we must be bold in our analysis, courageous in our organizing, and unwavering in our belief that different world is not only possible, it's necessary. Thank you. I'm looking forward to some questions. Hope I was quiet too. This cold is killing me.
You did beautifully. Thank you so much, Myriam, for rounding us off there, to talk about sort of like the actual impact it does have on the other aspects of the global south, on China's relations with Africa, and also reminding us that, you know, the way to liberation isn't making concessions to the right, isn't making concessions to the right wing, like Starmer seems to enjoy doing very much recently. We've seen all too well how reform has taken Starmer's sort of policies of austerity and conceding to the right, and they've run with it, and they have built a base of extremely not anti-imperialist and not anti-racist forces that are trying to build what they call an alternative. And so it's so important that we all connect these struggles together, whether it's racism, colonialism, imperialism, and indeed fascism on today's Victory Day celebration. So thank you again so much to all of our wonderful speakers for their contributions this evening. I know I've been taking so many notes today. I'm sure many people in the chat has been as well. I've been noticing there's been a lot of discussion, very healthy discussion as well. So I'm just gonna try and pick out a few questions for you. We've only got about half an hour or so to get through these. So I'll work sort of like backwards in terms of contributions. So we'll sort of like do a round of questions and we'll go from Myriam and the other way around. And then for the next round of questions, we'll go back that way, if that makes sense. We'll see how it plays out. So the first question is, please keep your comments and things going in the chat, people. Like, I'm sure, again, our speakers would love to read them. One of the first questions that has sort of come through is about the waves of discourse around the topic question of accelerationism, and whether it will create the conditions for a greater radicalization or the raising of class consciousness. So this person is wondering if you have any thoughts on this, since the acts and policies of the new, well, the Trump administration seem to be accelerating conditions both within the US and within the Western imperial core. And how should organizations be preparing alongside these rapid changes with, you know, the tariffs and the trade wars and the Cold Wars and potential hot wars in mind? Myriam, can I go to you first? Sorry, that was already one. Ooh, can't hear you. Still on mute. Oh, 1 second.
You muted us.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, can I go last? Because I need to wrap my brain around it. Sorry.
No problem. That was a bit of a convoluted question. But actually, sorry, I'll do another couple questions so you have some time to think. All right, I'll try and go for a slightly less wordy one. So another one that sort of pops up in the chat, I'm just gonna give my interpretation of it, but if the trade war fails, do you think we're heading to more sort of like a Cold War scenario, or and then a hot war, or do you think eventually we will just head straight to a hot war? And what can we, who are allied with the global south, sort of like in the West and the imperial core, what can we do about this? So those two questions are quite nicely linked, I guess, but this one is more about just what can we do in general, as opposed to what organizations can do. And let's see if I can find another sort of relevant one. I know we've got some China questions, we will take them, but I'll try to group them by theme. Okay, there's another one about the offshoring of US manufacturing impacting the ability of labor movements to gain momentum. And the person is wondering, how likely is it to organize, raise class consciousness, and mobilize the remaining sort of manufacturing demographic, especially within the US weapons manufacturing industry? And I'm presuming this is also in relation to the growing movements, or the very suppressed movement being taken for Palestine at the moment against sort of the arms trade. So 3 very sort of similar questions, but I think they all hit on different parts of organization, especially in the imperial core and the US. Myriam, are you ready to have a go, or should I throw it to somebody else? Oh yeah, sorry.
No, you asking us question and shutting us up.
No.
Yeah, just like maybe a quick summary on that. I think what organizations can do is like raising the class consciousness. I think that's where we are at. Working class people are the one that gonna be struggling more. But what political education are we doing in our own organizations? Like, how do we link the housing, for example, housing movement, to the anti-war movement? How do we link the healthcare movement or system into all this organizing? And what is the role of trade unions? I think this is where we are at the moment. It's like how, yeah, I'm looking at it in a perspective here in the UK as somebody that working within the housing system. It's very hard, it's very dark and grim, where rent is too high. I was watching a video today in America where there were actually Americans outside protesting over and asking for rent cap. I think all those sectors need to kind of find a way of united, because at the end of the day, it's capitalism, and I think this is where we need to start, is how do we start talking about bringing working class people together in organizing and mobilizing, but also having political education spaces, I guess. I hope that answered the question. I don't know, but there are smarter people in this.
No, I think that was I think the mentioning of trade unions is always a key one, because sometimes I think within the working classes here, there's a tendency to think it's literally just about the workplace and the company, and we don't broaden it to thinking about the role of us in the imperial core and the international solidarity we need to be having. And I see Margaret's got her hand up. You should be able to unmute yourself, hopefully.
Thank you. You know, it's interesting, that question of what the response of the masses of people will be to these moves. Here in the US, I worry that it will be people on the right who are activated. We don't have a strong left movement. We have a lot of confusion and frankly, just ignorance. Trump is representative of the people in that regard. So I don't know what will motivate people to mobilize for change. But you know, Trump, for example, not only is he making sure that we're all going to pay more money for the goods that we can still find, he also reestablished the having to pay back student loans. We have this terrible system where many young people go into debt in order to go to colleges and universities. And there was a pause during the COVID pandemic, excuse me, and Trump says it's over and we're going to garnish your wages. And there are people on Social Security, older people whose pensions are garnished for student loans. So I raise that as an example of something that can activate people. It is something that can depress people into feeling hopeless. So it's not clear to me and so I'm not answering your question. I guess I'm answering this to say that I'm not sure of what it could be. It could be things can go in a dangerous direction when you have people who are not politically educated, not class conscious. Who will they take their anger out on? Will it be on the ruling class? Will it be on their neighbor? Will they be mad at somebody because they're an immigrant, or any number of things? So that's the question that stood out for me, and that's my response.
Thank you. Radhika, I see your hand.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that Myriam and Margaret have said some very interesting things, and I wanted to add just a couple of points about these points that you raised. So on accelerationism, I just want to say that from what I understand of this term, I mean, I haven't heard this term for a long time, but from what I understand of it, I think that the idea is that, you know, you allow capitalism to sort of develop rampantly and so on. Unfortunately, and this would involve a very long discussion, but in my understanding, capitalism is not capable of going rampant. It is in a declining phase. The rate of investment in the core capitalist countries has been declining for a very long time. It is very low. China, of course, is able to be so economically dynamic because it keeps up a very high rate of investment, whereas the Western countries, no, they would rather make financial investments. And somebody pointed out, you know, and I agree with that as well, which is that, you know, the big problem is actually financialization, but financialization is not an independent problem. Again, it is a symptom of the fact that capitalism is slowing down. What happens when it slows down? It doesn't make productive investments. If it doesn't make productive investments, what does it do with the money it has? It puts them in financial investments. So at one level, perhaps accelerationism is not really the question. I think we are already living in a time when capitalism is decaying. It is becoming putrid. It is stinking to high heaven, in other words. But and so the real issue is, why don't we have the resources? Why don't we have the political organizations to deal with it? Now, there also, while of course class consciousness is very important and all those things, but you know, Marx said something very interesting. And on this, I believe he was right. Marx said that communism is not something we choose to do. Communism, I mean, we should choose to do it too, but it is inevitable. Now, you people may think of what did he mean? Like, what could he possibly mean? And I think what he meant by that is, and he called it the real movement. It's the real movement. And, you know, I've recently come up with a very good way of explaining it, because I'm always explaining this to my student. But recently, somebody in some context because the Americans are behaving so badly, I suppose, people have been recalling, or at least the American government, I should say, not all Americans, but the American government has been behaving so badly. People have been recalling Churchill's statement that the Americans can always be relied on to do the right thing after they have exhausted all the other options. And I think this is a very interesting way of thinking about the way in which that people, like, things are bad, people will try all sorts of things, and all the bad options will become exhausted, and then they'll be forced into the right option. And the function of class consciousness is to get us to the right option earlier, because, of course, the longer we delay, the more suffering there is. So class consciousness is important in that way. At the present moment in time, we are living through a time when the dissatisfaction of ordinary US citizens is can only be manifest in two ways. One is you vote for Trump because you end up believing that he is going to deliver on what he says, or you don't vote because you don't believe that the Democrats are going to take you to where they say they're going to take you. You've been betrayed by them time and time again. And the real issue is the total absence of an organized left alternative. And the ruling establishment has done everything possible to discredit socialist thinking, left-wing organizing, etc., etc. And this is what and they have been successful. And too many on the left have also played into their hands. But okay, so we are at bottom. But I think that, webinars like this and more generally, I think people are waking up to the fact that capitalism is finished. And I think that therefore this is the time to do what we need to do. On the question of Cold War and Hot War, I think that, again, there's so much to say on this, but I think honestly that rationally speaking, war would be too costly. The United States has historically refrained from war, generally speaking, not always. You have had a lot of wars, or they have tried to minimize their involvement, as in, for example, the Ukraine conflict or other conflicts like the Afghanistan conflict, where for a long time they were operating through proxies and so on. They've tried, because the thing is, war is a very costly thing, and rationally it does not make sense. But of course, who is to say that rationality will prevail when you've got somebody like Trump in the White House? So the possibility of war is definitely there. But I would say that, and even Trump seems to recognize somewhere, and he did get elected twice by saying that he's not going to start a new war, that he's going to end wars and so on. In fact, over the last 20 odd years, we've had presidents. Obama said he was going to end the war and so on. So, presidents have got elected by promising an end to war. And I just don't think in any country people are eager for war today. And finally, on offshoring, etc., I think that, yes, of course, the labor movement is how can you say, has taken a step back in the US and other places where there has been offshoring. But the fact is that, and this connects with the question about industrial policy. I think all countries need to have an economic strategy, which will include an industrial policy and so on. And that economic strategy must involve controlling the capitalists. Between about 1945 and 1980, there were hardly any financial crises in the world. Why? Because on the whole, the overwhelming majority of the countries of the world, including core capitalist Western countries, had capital controls. If you have capital controls, the big rich people cannot just take their wealth wherever they want to take it, etc. So I think that we need to think about, for too long, we have been lulled into this idea that there's going to be a global strategy. Yes, of course, the working class has no fatherland, that the eventual aim we are looking for is a worldwide socialism in which there is the fraternity and the sorority of human beings will be celebrated and all those wonderful things. But the way to get there is by imposing national control over capitalists. And any movement that is worth its salt, that any movement for socialism will have to begin by controlling the national economy, which means controlling the capitalist class and where it can take its money and what it's allowed to do. And I think that we need to get there. It's not just important to sit down and lament that, oh, capitalists are taking your jobs away. That's it. Sorry. I'm done. And Fiona, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I was just say, if you're not a speaker, please keep yourself muted. Otherwise, I'm going to have to do the weird ask participants to unmute themselves thing, which makes it tricky for our speakers. Thank you. Sorry, please continue, Radhika.
No, I was done. That was the end of
okay.
the things I wanted to say. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Carlos, did you have anything to add for any of those questions?
Yeah, sure. Like there's been lots of talk in the chat, questions around China's social system and whether it engages in unequal exchange.
Or can we pause on that for the next round of questions, if that's okay?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, like, you know, if you've got 45 minutes, I can give you a fairly comprehensive answer, but I'm kind of assuming that we don't have 45 minutes.
Unfortunately, not today.
I'll just say something about this question of if the trade war fails, are we concerned about the possibilities of a hot war? Like, what's clear is that yes, while US economic power may be waning, it's still the major military power. Like, it's the only military superpower by quite some margin. It's got its 800 overseas bases. It's got the deployment of literally hundreds of thousands of troops around the world. And, you know, if Mao Zedong said that power grows out the barrel of a gun, well, the US has got a lot of guns. And, you know, there's no question that the US is putting the pieces in place for a potential war if it decides that that serves its interests. Although I certainly agree with Radhika that there are significant dangers for the US in preparing such a war, and there's absolutely no guarantee that it would win such a war. But I think, you know, what we can do and what we should do is to focus on building and strengthening the anti-war movement, you know, an anti-imperialist war movement that's able to break with capitalist ideology and that's able to have, you know, a mass base and have a profound impact on public opinion, and thereby put whatever pressure we can on our governments to change course. You know, the Vietnam War, of course, was primarily won by the Vietnamese people, in spite of what Hollywood tells us. But, you know, the anti-war movement did play an important role in making that war non-viable for the US government. And, you know, similarly, you know, China's going to take the lead in defending itself from any war. You know, we don't have to worry too much about that. And on that basis, China's military modernization, its ability to defend itself, is extremely important. But we also definitely have a role to play. You know, and at the moment, I kind of think the biggest part of that is opposing the propaganda war, opposing the demonization of China. You know, this propaganda war is war propaganda. It's designed to win public support for hostility and aggression towards China. You know, we can be pointing out to people that China isn't actually this dystopian hellhole, that it's playing a far more positive role in the world than the West is. For example, bringing, you know, the 14 Palestinian liberation factions together in Beijing to sign a unity agreement, or facilitating a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or putting forward serious proposals for an end to the war in Ukraine, or for that matter, you know, being by far the world's only renewable energy superpower. You know, if the US is the world's military superpower, China is the world's green energy superpower. So I think there's a lot of work for us to do in countering the propaganda war and in developing mass opposition to cold wars or hot wars against China.
Thank you, Carlos. I think that takes us quite nicely to the next set of questions. I've noticed some of them are quite similar, so forgive me if I'm sort of paraphrasing from a few of yours. But the key one, I think, with regard to propaganda war that perhaps you can answer and some of the speakers can answer, is someone is curious to hear about a materialist socialist perspective on the economic relationship / arrangements between China and African countries, in particular sub-Saharan African countries. and whether these can or should be viewed as exploitative, which is a very common claim that is made. Would you like to share some thoughts on it? I'm happy to go Carlos and the other way around this time. Yeah.
Yeah, do you want me to come in on that?
Yeah, I feel like this is a meaty one, so I'll take just one at a time with the next couple, if that's okay.
Sure. I mean, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail apart from anything else. It's the sort of thing that you need to do a bit of preparation for.
Yeah.
I have written on this subject and I've shared a link in the chat. So hopefully people will take a look at that when they've got time. I think, yes, like China invests in other countries, including countries in Africa, and China lends money to governments and to companies in Africa, and it is involved in a huge number of infrastructure projects. And I'm sure there's very valid criticisms to be made of lots of deals that are made. But the important thing to remember, like the key aspect is like foreign investment is not the definition of imperialism. Imperialism, if you look at the word, it's clearer in Spanish because imperialismo and the word for empire is imperio. So imperialism is empirism. So imperialism isn't investing in foreign countries. It's not export of capital per se. If it was, then Angola would be an imperialist country in relation to Portugal because Angolan state-owned companies invest in Portuguese infrastructure and various projects there. So we live in a globalized economy where literally dozens, scores, most of the countries in the world are engaged in some level of investment in capital. So that doesn't by itself, that's a necessary but not sufficient condition for being imperialist. The question is, does that investment, do those loans go along with any kind of coercion? Does China enforce loan conditionality when it lends money to Congo, when it lends money to Ethiopia? Do the conditions for those loans involve things like privatizing your water system or privatizing your education system in the same way that IMF loans, World Bank loans, and Western multilateral lending institutions do? Do they come up with the threat or the use of military force? Like that's pretty key, right? A very reactionary journalist from the New York Times, Thomas Friedman, famously said that there's no McDonald's without McDonnell Douglas. You can't have the US's economic power without, he used the expression a mailed fist, right? There's a military basis to US economic power. You can't say that about China. There's no equivalent slogan in relation to China. No one says there's no Huawei without the People's Liberation Army. So China is engaged in all sorts of deals, all sorts of investment, all sorts of lending, but it's done on the basis of negotiations and equality, where countries and companies are able to negotiate and agree deals that hopefully serve both countries' interests and and have a mutually beneficial characteristic. So in general, I would say the stories of the new colonialism in Africa, which have been put forward by the likes of Hillary Clinton and Rex Tillerson and Marco Rubio and et cetera, some combination of kind of propaganda hysteria and sour grapes at China's very rapidly developing relations with that continent of Africa. And Myriam actually mentioned in her contribution one thing that was agreed at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in Beijing last year, I believe in September, was that China would give tariff-free access to all least developing countries, around 33 of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. So that's, it resonates because we're talking about tariffs today, where the US, where the Trump administration is throwing tariffs around like confetti, including placing tariffs on countries that are populated exclusively by penguins that don't actually have a human population. China is getting rid of tariffs and giving tariff-free access on all product lines to the poorest countries, the majority of which are in Africa. So I think we can agree at the very least that China's economic posture vis-a-vis the developing world and the global South is fundamentally different to that of North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carlos. I know I put you on the spot there. But now you can't say you're not an expert, because that was a brilliant response. I see Margaret had her hand up.
Yeah, very quickly, I have to say this about this comparison of China with, people say it's the new colonizer and it's just like European colonization. Is China chopping off people's hands in Congo? No, it isn't. I really, it bothers me when we think about how cruel, Germany's first concentration camps were in Namibia. The British had concentration camps in Kenya in the 1950s and then destroyed all the evidence of the atrocities they committed. So if we're going to talk about China being just like fill in the blank, you have to talk about what fill in the blank actually did. Whatever the problems are, whatever the contradictions are, China's not enslaving Africans. China is not crushing liberation movements. So however you want to analyze this letting off the hook of this terrorism that was inflicted on the continent is really quite annoying to me. That's it.
Thank you, Margaret. And Myriam?
Yeah, thank you, Carlos and Margaret, for that well-detailed stuff. I'm just gonna be brief. Like, as somebody's country that have just undergone a somewhat of a revolution, and we have overthrown a government that has been decade a imperialist puppet, I'm kind of seeing the other side of things, and as being involved in a way with the government and following closely what's going on. What is quite interesting, for example, I'll give you a simple example. In Senegal, we have our main road are built by Eiffage, which is a company which is a French company, and Eiffage gonna be right now. Every single profit we get from that from the highway, the way you stop and pay, which is ridiculous. The way we paying is actually ridiculous. It's gonna stop 10,000 stop before you get into one direction. At each stop you pay. Each of those profit, actually Eiffage is the one getting it, and we don't gain anything from it because Eiffage built it. They brought their own workers. They were built by their own workers and really exploited the workers in that. Now, in hindsight, the roads that are right next to my house is built by Chinese companies, which are employing that deals was finalized, was renegotiated and refinalized by the new government, and the workers are actually are Senegalese workers. The workers are those that they have great benefits and are paid decently. So for me, which made me understand is actually it's not China's fault if we are ripping aside bad of the bargain. It's actually the governments that we had. A government, for example, the previous Senegalese government right now has embezzled a huge amount of the taxpayer money, embezzled so much, have ripped off the country, bad deals, whether it's with BP or French companies, so on and so forth. Right now, for example, today, our Prime Minister has said, our Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko has said, la priorité des plus d'aller emprunter pour basically the priority in solo is not no more to go and borrow money to build this big edifice to show that we are actually a rich country, but actually we are going to get investment just to build a real economy, the agriculture, farming, fishery, and a transforming industry for infrastructure. So, and that is what we are getting with China. We have seen it also with Burkina Faso, a simple example, where there was French companies within the mining that didn't want to pay the taxes, refused to pay the taxes. China said, okay, I'm saying yes to everything that you're saying. We'll pay this amount of taxes. We're going to do this the way we are asking us to do. So it's all about the imperialist puppet that would rather work with the with countries that just still want to colonize and have their knee in our necks. So let's also take it there as well. Personally, that's what I've got to know.
Thanks so much, Miriam. I think it's really important to have those sort of, if anything, first-hand observations, because I think a lot of the rumoring or disinformation, misinformation that comes around China often comes, ironically, from the West and oftentimes from the diaspora as well. I know, as part of the Chinese diaspora myself, people make up a lot of bullshit, to put it pretty bluntly. So it is very important to carve through it with the actual facts, with the actual realities of people on the ground, as opposed to just pulling things out of thin air and making wild speculations. And Radhika, did you have anything else you wanted to add with regard to this specific question topic?
No, I think Carlos and others have said really what needs to be said. All I'll say is that, I think that the term imperialism is very badly misunderstood. People think that, I mean, of course, Carlos is right when he says that imperialism is about empire, but not all empires are the same. I mean, the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire or the Roman Empire, I mean, these were all empires with very different dynamics. But with the onset of capitalism, you got a very different type of imperialism, which was driven by the requirements of capitalism. And that is a completely different category, and you can't compare the two. I have no doubt that there were elements of the other empires that required something to be criticized. But what has happened under capitalist imperialism is qualitatively different. Only in capitalist imperialism, you have had the type of, like concentration camps were invented in Namibia. They and in general, the kind of genocidal and a kind of capitalism we've had, an enormously exploitative kind of capitalism you've had, where once you have the establishment of such an imperialism, you often find that people's per capita food intake goes down. Just imagine. You're already looking at societies that are not exactly, as rich as we are today on a per capita basis, but their per capita food consumption goes down. What are you to say? It reveals a type of extractivist capitalism that takes away your products, that takes away your food, that takes away your raw materials, that takes away your labor, that takes away surpluses, everything. This is something completely different. And, one of the things that you find in the mainstream discourse, as well as in many corners of Marxist discourse, is that the prosperity of the West is attributed to the productive dynamism of capitalism. No, folks, there is something called imperialism. And while undoubtedly the high levels of investment that imperialism enables in first world countries does increase productivity, I've no doubt. I've visited some pretty amazing factories, and sure, I believe that this is partly to do with that, but it is only partly to do with the superior productivity. And today, with the levels of investment we are seeing in Western countries, even that cannot be really held up as a reason. So really, we're talking, the prosperity of the West relies on imperialism. And coming back to another question that was raised earlier, part of the reason why we all need to think about economic strategy of controlling your economy and so on, and essentially not just partnering with China, but also using the lessons that China has to offer to the rest of the world. I mean, how do you create a prosperous economy? Is you do it by pursuing the methods that it has of planning, of controlling your capital, managing trade, all those things. Because you see, if I am right, that the prosperity of the West relies on imperialism to a very substantial extent, then the loss of imperial power is going to mean that if we wish to maintain some sort of half decent level of standard of living, and I certainly think we can do with a lot less like on average, I mean, I don't mean working people, but, the per capita standard of living could go down a little bit for environmental reasons, social justice reasons, etc. But if we are going to have a decent standard of living, we're going to need to plan our economies, because we are going to have to produce what we were previously extracting. And that's the key. And we have to, for too long, the left has thought that capitalism is going to solve the problems of production. All we need to think about is redistribution. No, folks, we are going to also have to roll up our sleeves and get down to planning production.
Thank you so much, Radhika. I think, again, you hit so many of the questions that are being asked in the chat. But unfortunately, in the interest of time, that's all we really have time for today. But that's not to say we won't explore some of these topics, some of these really key questions that really need more than, an hour and a half session, or even the few short minutes that each speaker has been able to contribute. So thank you so much for providing your questions. We will look at the chat, look back at all the key topics that have been raised, and hopefully we'll cover them at some point in the very, very near future. And perhaps some of our wonderful speakers would like to come back and speak on some of those things too. But just to give everyone a quick opportunity, I would say no more than a minute, please, because I know we are running a little bit behind on time, just to just a closing remarks, final remarks from yourself, or a small message you want to give to the people watching this webinar today. And I will take you in the same order we spoke at the beginning. So if you go, Margaret, would you like to begin?
I just want to thank you again for inviting me. Thanks everyone for being here. This is the kind of thing we all need to be doing. We are kept in a state of ignorance. It's by design, and we all have to make all the efforts that we can to break out of these poisonous narratives which tell us that up is down and white is black and so forth, which leads to people actually thinking that, a tariff war from Trump is going to be something beneficial. So this is what you should be doing. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Margaret. And Radhika, back to you.
Yeah, I think I'll just echo what Margaret has said. I think that it's been wonderful. It's a great community. It would be great to be part of. I mean, thank you for inviting us to be part of it, and looking forward to further such discussions.
Wonderful. And Carlos?
Yeah. Also, echo what Margaret said. I think she said it absolutely perfectly. Thank you so much for the invite. It has been a really, really interesting, vibrant discussion. I feel like there's a lot of questions that went unanswered, and sorry about that, but I guess there's only so much we can do. But I guess that provides us with some motivation to have more sessions and to continue the discussion, and to share analysis and resources and links and whatnot offline. Speaking of which, and because it is Victory in Europe Day, or at least today's the day that it's celebrated in Western Europe. Russia celebrates it tomorrow, I believe. The International Manifesto Group, which Radhika and I are both organizers of, is putting together a webinar on next Sunday, so the 18th of May, called The Fight Against Fascism Then and Now, 80 Years After the Defeat of Nazism. There'll be a Zoom session, so should be really interesting. Please do attend if you're available, and I will put a link in the chat. Thank you.
Beautiful. Please pop that link in, and we will try to send it around ourselves as well. And again, last but not least, Myriam.
Yeah, I'm just going to thank all the speakers and thank everyone that joined us today, and hopefully we can have some of more this educational stuff for BLA. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And please, webinar people who are still here, please do send a massive thanks and your feedback to our speakers in the chat. And of course, thank you from myself, from the Black Liberation Alliance ourselves, to you all for attending, but to our amazing speakers for really sort of knuckling down and getting through a lot of really sort of tricky and complex topics. It's not easy to try and cram, years worth of study into just a few minutes, but I think you've done an amazing job, and I'm sure everyone here would agree. And yeah, I think just again to note that, you know, these webinars, they are set up entirely by volunteers. Volunteers who've been doing tech, who have been dropping links in the chat, who have put a lot of work into making this event happen today. So please do follow us on social media, on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and probably some other ones too. And we also have like a tip jar on Coffee where you can drop us like £1 or £2 if you would like to support our work and help us to keep these things on for free. We think that the educational part is so important of political education and our political activism as well, because if we're not well informed, how can we know how to act? How can we know what strategies we can use to inform ourselves? And also the challenging of Western sort of like production of knowledge as the center of knowledge is something we also really want to challenge as well. So we hope you learned a lot today and you have perhaps started to question some of the things you believed before you came to the session. I think that's always an excellent thing to come away from something, having your worldview slightly challenged, slightly sort of changed, or perhaps has made you more curious about a certain fact. Please do email us if you would like to get involved or would you like to learn more about certain topics. We always love getting feedback and hearing how people think our sessions have gone. And just for especially those based in Britain, we just wanted to update you on a few upcoming events. So, you know, it's not just about educational events. There are a multitude of different ways you can get involved in political activism, in organizing, in campaigning.